It says we are live, so hi guys. I'm trying to see if it's working on actual YouTube page. Can you guys hear?
It says we are live.
There we go.
So hi guys.
Is it working?
Yes, it's working. So there's kind of a delay. I apologize for that. It should be all good. Hi everyone, I'm Susan Dennard. Thank you for coming. And this is my dear friend Akshaya.
Hello.
Ax, say hi.
Hello.
Yes, so we are going to talk about world building tonight. And the reason we are doing this was Akshaya asked me like a week or two ago. She had some questions on world building and she asked if I would answer them, which of course I said yes. And then I was like, these might be helpful to people everywhere, so why don't we make it a live chat? And she very kindly agreed to that. So thank you for doing that, my dear. You're very nice.
Of course. I hope these are helpful to other people.
I hope so too. So we have a series of questions that Akshaya made up along with some other writers that hopefully have cover broad things. And then once we kind of get through those, we will turn to your questions. And I believe we can see those in the chat thing. Yes, we can. It's moving very fast though, so we'll try to keep up. And if we don't ask or we don't answer, try again so we can watch. All right, so my dear, ask away. Our first question.
Okay, so I thought we would start with some general world building questions and then maybe stuff that's more specific to Truthwitch and the Witchlands, and then other questions.
All right.
Okay, so hopefully this is a kind of easy one. Where do you start your world building? Is it with like a magic system, a setting, a detail?
That's a good question. I'm glad I saw these earlier because I wouldn't have had an answer. I had to think about it. So I feel like for me, and everyone's going to be different, so do what works for you. And I feel I should make that disclaimer right now. Like, this is what I do. I do not pretend to be an expert on writing or world building. So this is just what I do, and maybe it will work for you. For me, I get the first idea for a world from a feeling, sort of like an aesthetic maybe that I'm going for. So, for example, you guys know when you think of the movie Hocus Pocus, like it immediately evokes that fall Halloween feel. I feel like that kind of an atmosphere is always my starting point for when it comes to world building. So when it came to Something Strange and Deadly, my first series, I wanted to like tap into that steampunk Victorian feel, gas lamp world. And then with Truthwitch, I wanted to tap into like an Adriatic Sea Croatian vibe, and I don't know if I succeeded, but that's at least where the first sparks for an idea and for a new world came to me. Yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, that's really cool that you start with like a vibe or an aesthetic. When I think of world building, I tend to think of it as like two different things. Maybe it's just me, but like there's like the bigger structural world building, like a religion or a culture or magic system. And then there's like the specific detail that's like how that bigger thing trickles down to like the scene level. So like if you have a religion, like what does a place of worship for that religion look like? What are the stuff that's in it? So, I mean, do you separate your world building out that way?
Yes and no. I mean, on the one hand, I'm like super not scientific about it, especially if I'm like doing a first draft. I tend to just kind of write whatever I discover alongside the reader. But that doesn't work once you're like revising and you realize that maybe you've broken your own rules, or you don't even have rules. And I do think that every world needs rules, and you have to you do have to think about like why things are there. And so when it comes to sort of the macro world building versus the micro world building, like you were saying, so I would say the macro would be what's the religion, for example, and then the micro would be, to me, how that's actually represented in your world, like through a temple or through some sort of ritual maybe. And so that kind of stuff I will like really, I'm very strict about it, maybe to the point of being a little crazy, but I do sit down before I do like maybe my biggest round of revisions after I've finished a draft, and I write it all out so that I have like a guide to stick to. Now, the guide will certainly change as I'm revising and layering in new details, and I'm really bad at keeping it up to date, but at least I try and I make one when I first sit down. I'm especially strict about that when it comes to the magic systems, because I feel like you need rules for magic in order for it to feel real. And even if the reader never fully learns them, you, the author, should know. Yeah, so I guess I do kind of divide it between like large scale, small scale. I definitely try to stick to rules with large scale, and then that sort of what I'm sticking to, the rules, are reflected in how the world actually comes to life on the page. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense.
You think it makes sense? Let's take a quick look at the chat and see if anyone else is saying anything. All right, they're all talking about Hocus Pocus. Cool. I appreciate that. Go for it.
So when do you do your world building? Like, is it before you draft, after you revise once? Or?
That's a good question. So when do I do it? All the time, I guess. I know, like I said, so I tend to discover the world, which works very well in first books. In second books, you need to have your world pretty well established. But in the first book, you know, in Something Strange and Deadly or in Truthwitch, I was world building as I wrote. I was like learning new things about it and like how the magic worked and who they worshipped and how the cultures interacted. And then when it comes time to revise, then I sit down and I almost codify it, you know, turn it into the rules that I'm going to stick to, maybe, hopefully. And then I'm a layer writer, so I like layer through each draft and add more and more and more. And so especially with the world building, those details just get added in more and more with each layer, to the point where my editor is like, too much, TMI, let's pull back on the world just a little bit here. But at least, you know, better to have too much and then I pull some out than maybe not enough. Because at least I do think that the more you, the writer, know about your world, the more real whatever does land on the page, the more real that will feel to your readers.
Sure. And this is just I'm just like curious about this. How did you feel like your world building, how did you do your world building for Windwitch that you just finished versus like Truthwitch and like?
That is an excellent question. Because it's a second book. So, and I'm going in, so the interesting thing about the Witchlands series is that it's massive. I made kind of a big world and set out to explore all of it. So with Windwitch, we're going to new places, and we're actually in 3 different places with different points of view characters. And so there was like sort of exploring new cultures, as well as Akshaya was one of my readers. This sweet woman actually read this book for me right before I finished and helped me with feedback. So she knows what's coming. So I'll try to not be spoilery, and try not to like bore you as well, X, with stuff you already know. But I had to, again, stick to the rules that I had already set up, which I had kind of forgotten between Truthwitch and Windwitch, so I had to refresh myself on my own series. I did that by listening to the audiobook, which was an interesting experience, and making notes like about the kinds of things that I had forgotten that were in there, the little details that maybe got added in on the very first layer through.
Right.
But then a lot of other things I had already planned on including, so I already had those bones established or planned upon. One thing that I like to do, and that I did in Truthwitch, and that I'm doing even more so in Windwitch, is to set up everything that's going to come in the setting. So there's like little hints of what's to come in the world around my characters all the time. And so that's especially important in Windwitch, where we go to places like ruins or temples or things like that that are all gonna impact the story later. And I guess that's kind of a really tip from Suze. thing to have with your world building is that it needs to matter to the story. So you can't just like throw out sensory, or you want sensory details, but you can't just throw out like a cool temple unless the temple is important to the story, or if it bears some weight on the character's development, why they are the way they are, or who they might become. And you can do that. I mean, you can throw in all sorts of cool details and have them matter to the story. But yeah, you don't just want to throw it in there because it looks cool.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. So again, this is just me being curious about this. Did you feel like there were like rules that you established in the first book that you found yourself like revisiting in the second book, or like do you feel like you wrote yourself into a corner?
Yes, I mean, there are definitely things where I was like, Suze, why did you like set that way? Like, why did you make the monks this way? Couldn't you have changed that a little bit so that it would be easier right now? Or like I have way too many, I just have too many cultures and I want them all to be in the book. And so that can be hard in like in distinguishing the cultures in a way that feels real to the reader but doesn't overwhelm the reader. And I have like oops, sorry, that was a dog. I have way too many like elite fighting forces, but I mean, logically that would make sense, right? That every ruler would have their own sort of set of bodyguards, but it gets overwhelming to the reader if you have like, 6 different sets of cool bodyguards. So those are the kinds of things where it's just like, I wish I had maybe thought a little smaller from the get-go and then expanded, but it's not what I did. Threw everything at you in Truthwitch, and now I'm dealing with that.
Well, I mean, I feel like you introduced a lot of things in Truthwitch, but you deepened them in Windwitch, so I don't think it's necessarily, I mean, I don't think personally that was overwhelming.
Thanks.
But okay, so going back to something you said before about like keeping track of all your world building, you said you have like a guide that you don't maybe keep up with, but like what goes in your guide?
Wow. So the things that would go in my guides would be notes, like I would have it divided by the different cultures, and like whatever sort of little detail I throw in there. Like, for example, I remember with the Nomatsi people in Truthwitch, I happened to mention in passing that they have burning ceremonies for their dead. It was just something I threw in a sentence, but that's important. Like, I can't forget that. Because if suddenly in a later book in the series someone does, they don't burn their dead, someone might notice. They probably won't, but they might, and I don't want to have screwed that up. It's a lot of little details to remember, though, so I try to write those things down. Yeah, I have lots of like, I write way too many like songs for. I'm like J.R. Tolkien. I like write too many songs for things. There were too many songs in Windwitch. I cut a few, but there's still some in there. And so those kinds of things are, specific to a culture, and I write them in the guide. Yeah, I just, anything that I think of, like, this gets into, that's in the micro realm of things. When it comes to how I actually first start the guide, I suppose I should say, I start big. This is who the ruler is, this is where they're located, this is maybe what, God they believe in. And then I get into all the little details. I do try to keep some things open so that if I find in a later book, like, I don't want it to be that way, I didn't write myself in a corner. So, yeah, I guess start big, go little, but at the same time, while you're drafting, allow yourself to discover cool new things alongside your characters, because that's really the fun part. I feel like I'm being incoherent, so sorry, guys. I'm trying to keep my thoughts organized, but I'm not a very good speaker.
Stop. Okay, so when you have like this guide, do you have like a general guide that you use for every book, or do you make your own guide for like every specific world?
Wait, I missed that. So
like between books, like do you have like, okay, when I do my world building, I'm going to keep track of all of these things and that's something that follows you from series to series? Or do you like make up a new one for when you're working on this world?
More like make up a new one. I mean, I'm not very organized. I wish that I was, and I've tried a million times to be, but I'm just not. If you could see the state of my hard drive, I don't have an established like file naming system. It's a mess. And I tried to be better with Windwitch, but I ultimately probably wasn't. So I work in Scrivener. I highly recommend Scrivener to all writers everywhere, especially if you work in fiction. And then I have, because you have the option of having like research as a section and where you can just keep notes. And so in that, I would have something like, for example, I have a file that goes in each one that's the colors of the threads, because I need to know what colors all the threads are and what those emotions correspond to for a Solt's character. So there's that file. I have a file that's got just like a cast of characters, and one of the things that I like to do for a character is that they all have a physical quirk. So like Merrick's always tensing his shoulders or fidgeting with his clothes. Ageman's always rolling his wrists because he's a fighter. That's what we do. And so I just keep track of those little things because I'll forget their twitches, you know, between books and when you're doing other things. And then I have a file that's like about the different cultures. I'll have a file that's all of the sayings. Because each of the characters in this world has a mentor of some kind that's taught them things, and they're constantly thinking about what that person taught them. I have a file of, you know, life lessons from Aunt of Rain, things like that. This series is way bigger. I mean, when I did this with Something Strange and Deadly, which is not small either, I was easier. I had just like one notebook that I kept all of the like magic rules and technology rules. And then sort of I had like a massive folder on my hard drive with all the research that I'd found. So I do try to keep it organized per project, but there's not like a general world building spot.
I mean, from what you said, that sounds pretty organized to me.
Maybe.
Like, I mean, I don't know what you mean by more organized than that. But with all those things, this is something that like my critique partners and I always talk about, is like feeling overwhelmed by world building. And not just like the sheer number of details, but like having to figure out all those details. How do you stop from feeling overwhelmed?
When I finish, I'll put like a link to an awesome world building questionnaire from Patricia Reed, who wrote the Enchanted Forest Chronicles. Excellent, like middle grade fantasy. It's intense. I tried once to like fill out every question in it for a project, and it was like, this could take me a year just to answer every question. But it's a good way to like, if you really want to think deep and hard about your world building, it's a great questionnaire. But it's overwhelming. And I guess the way I avoid being overwhelmed, like one, I think world building is the most fun. So, you know, for me, that's like a great procrastination technique. Like, I'm not working. I mean, I'm working. I am, right? I'm working. I'm world building. That's important. But the reality is that I am procrastinating. And then two, again, like I try to not worry too much about the details, and especially not in first draft. That's what the layers are for, right? Layering in more character, layering in more showing instead of telling, layering in the setting better, as well as more sensory details. Each layer gets more and more, and so that feels way less overwhelming then. But I do also, because I like can procrastinate so much with world building, I know I did this with Something Strange and Deadly, because with Something Strange and Deadly, it was historical, so you could fall down like a research wormhole. Right. And so I had to cap it before each book. I was allowed to research for 1 month. You know, I could study Philadelphia or Paris or Egypt for 1 month, and then I had to start writing. And so I wouldn't have everything answered, but at least I would know enough about the world to have a vibe, and I could write and then fill in details or fix things later. So that's sort of I think a good, if you're like me and you love to world build, like cap yourself. Seriously, guys, like give yourself, 2-3 weeks of that and then stop. I think you just need to feel the world, feel it enough that you can write it, and then you can fill in all the little details later.
So that kind of brings me to my next question about when do you stop world building? Like not just in terms of cutting yourself off, but like it's something that you can do endlessly, especially when you have like a series. So like, do you ever stop world building, or is it just like, okay, I'm turning in my book and that's when it ends?
I mean, there is that point. I mean, I guess, yes, there's a point where, especially if it's just later in the series, where you've given all that you need for the story. Like, there's no need necessarily to add more to the world. The reader knows the world, they know enough about the world, and now at this point you're just, fleshing out the setting and wherever the story is taking place. But I imagine that, like, especially because there's going to be an element of mystery in this series, I mean, there's like a lot of loose ends at the end of each book. Who is doing that? Who's doing this? Who's behind what? And that's not going to be figured out for a few more books. And so those sorts of things will be hinted at in the world, but they won't necessarily be fully divulged until later. And so I think it's important to remember that plot, character, and world building are ultimately, they go hand in hand, or hand in hand. They're inseparable, and they should each dictate the other. Your character is a function of the world that they grew up in. The plot, it's happening in this world, which means that it is going to be affected by the world, and it's going to affect the world. And because the character and the world are so closely tied, they're obviously affecting the plot. So they're not separate entities. If you can take a story and set it in a different place entirely, then you have failed. I'm sorry. But the world should never be something that can just be replaced. It should be critical to the story as well as to the characters.
Yeah, that's so valid. So what are some of your favorite worlds? Specifically books.
Books. I have to say it depends on in terms of recommending to people, what maybe is a good book to read for good world building. If you're writing fantasy, George R.R. Martin, Game of Thrones is it's a huge hit for a reason. That is some incredible world building that feels so real. My brother was like not a fantasy reader at all. He's Mr. History. But I got him obsessed with fantasy, and his gateway drug was Game of Thrones, because I was like, trust me, it feels real. Like, you're gonna like this. It's very historical. Another writer who I think is really similar to that, but that I actually prefer even more, is Robin Hobb. She has this one series, the Live Ship Traders series, that is amazing. And it's just like such a rich, different world, it's pirates and stuff. Who doesn't like pirates? No. And magic and dragons. But it still feels very real, and I think that's kind of the key, right? Like, you can have the very fairy tale-esque fantasy, and that has its own type of world building. I personally prefer and tend to write the more fantastical that I hope I can convince you feel real, and that's what I like to read. Another excellent fantasy one for world building is the INDA series, and I will try to write all of these as well in the little description below. But the INDA series by Sherwood Smith, awesome. Holy crap, those are awesome. Really dense fantasy, adult fantasy, all of them, but incredible world building. And yeah, let's see, in terms of like other genres, I have to say, like, sci-fi tends to, if you go with like the classics, you're gonna get some really awesome world building, but also these days, John Scalzi's stuff I really like. I think he does excellent world building. But I'm imagining that most of the people watching are wanting to write fantasy, because I feel like that is what most people in YA that I talk to are writing about and reading. I'm kind of looking at the chat, but there is a bit of a delay. But yeah, I actually think adult fantasy is the best way to learn world building. Because YA, like, it's not that we don't do it, but I don't think it's been done nearly as long. Like, the
Right.
YA fantasy shelf is significantly smaller than the adult fantasy shelf. And because of that, people have had to push the boundaries a lot further and try new things and really differentiate themselves than they've had to do in YA. And so I think you can see a lot of really cool stuff in the adult world.
Okay, great. So I'm wondering, do you want to look through some of these questions and do some general stuff before we talk about the Witchlands, or do you just want to keep going through my questions?
Oh, that's cool. If we can skim through. Yes, someone says Brandon Sanderson has an amazing world building. This is true. This is absolutely true. Agreed. His is like really dense. You can tell he thinks really hard about his world, which is awesome. So highly recommend. He has all the layers that we wouldn't be allowed to include in YA just because it gets big really fast, but awesome. Oh, Ancillary Justice. Yes. Sci-fi book with amazing world building. Yes. How could I forget that? Oh my gosh. Yes. Whoever said that, Katie, I think. Thank you. Good call. All right. Do you see other questions?
Yes, I like this one because it's very applicable to me. When you're editing your work, how do you keep yourself from becoming extremely critical on yourself?
I'm not very good at that. I guess, I mean, I'm pretty awful and critical of my own work. I kind of feel like most people in the creative world are. I have the lucky whip of a deadline and wanting to get paid, so that keeps me motivated to keep going even if I feel terrible about myself. I guess one of the big things that I constantly tell myself is that I can always fix it later.
Right.
And to some extent I can, you know, even now with the Wind Witch almost completely, totally done. I still have one chance if I absolutely have to fix something. And so, yeah, just try to remember, like, it doesn't take any published author one draft. And if it does, then the book probably isn't that great, or they're lying to you. I really hate that more authors aren't a little bit more forthcoming about how difficult it is and how many drafts we go through, and we don't just all crap gold. It is I mean, anyone who follows me knows I have a hell of a time writing books. It's not easy for me. It takes me a while, and it's a struggle. I love doing it, which is why I continue to, but it's not easy. And I think, like, when I got an agent, when I queried Something Strange and Deadly, that was like the 11th draft of that book. So that's, and I ain't no shame. I mean, like I said too, I layer through. So I don't even know how many layers went into Wind Witch. I got like totally lost count. And Truth Witch too. That book got layered over and over and over again. And so you can always fix it. Just remember, like, if you have to go through it one more time, you have to go through it one more time. You'll get it where you want to be. Do we have any good questions?
Yeah, I'm looking.
Yes, Mara Fitzgerald, feel better about being on your 6th draft and not done.
Do you change your mind about world building details often?
Do I change my mind about them? Is that what the question was?
Yes.
I mean, yes. Like, for example, in Wind Witch, I originally had these like really cool giant statues on either side of a bridge coming into the capital of New Brevna. And they were like super important in the story for like the first, I don't know, 12 drafts. And then it became clear that that direction of the story was no longer the way I was ultimately going to leave it. And these sentries just, they like no longer served a purpose to the plot. And so I mentioned them in passing because they're there, and I mentioned them in Truth Witch, but they're no longer something that I go to great lengths to describe because they no longer matter to the plot. So there's no point in me wasting the reader's time, you know, describing them.
Okay, question. Do you ever worry about falling into the Lost Season 4 trap of over-explaining the lore of your world?
Yes. This has been a really big struggle for me because I had to set up a lot in Truthwitch in the first book, in the first 100 pages, because for the way the story is built, you had to at least understand the basics of the world. And I know that scared off a lot of readers. It kind of made me sad that I couldn't do it better and draw people in better. But then I realized that anyone who liked it likes world building like I do, and that's good. That's who I want reading my book. And so it's very top heavy in Truthwitch with the world building. And then not so much. You know the world and you follow the story. In Windwitch, I have to introduce all these other things that are going to collide in later books, but I have to reveal them a little bit at a time because, again, like, you don't want to overwhelm the reader, but you also don't want to remove the mystery of what's going on. And so that's been a really hard struggle for me, and I'm not entirely sure I did it well. We shall see when you all read Windwitch. You may end up being more confused than you were when you started, or I hope not, but we'll see. We'll see. The other thing, and I'm guilty of this, especially in my first series, is that like maybe you don't hint enough, and then you're forced to do a lot of info dumping at the end. And I kind of ended up doing that in my third Something Strange and Deadly book. There's one scene that comes to mind where I'm just like, well, that was a big old info dump. But sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes that is what happens. As long as you don't get one of those like Bond villain moments where they're like, and this is my nefarious plan, I think you're good. Can I just say again to everyone that I'm really jealous that it's still sunny for you, because it's like pitch black outside and this light makes you look really red.
3 hours earlier for me. 3 hours earlier. It was this light 3 hours ago for you.
Maybe. I'm still jealous.
Okay. Oh, this was maybe like a fun question. What is your favorite part of building a world?
What is my favorite part of building a world? Everything. I am bad about it. I will just like daydream everything. I love to make up the like little details. Those are my favorite parts. So like there's this one little part where I don't want to spoil that. There's a scene in Windwitch where somebody loses their shirt, and in that scene they see like fireflies in the shadows, and it brings to mind this song that their father used to sing, and it's like little details like that I love. But I will go overboard with them, and my editor will be like, too much, and so maybe one day I'll just make it like extras, Windwitch or Witchland's extras guide, all those little details that never made it in the book.
That would be amazing. And I would read it. I like that scene a lot.
Oh, bless you.
Okay, maybe one last question for now. How much world building do you plan ahead when handling a series? And how do you deal when some elements fall through in like revisions?
So how do I deal if things fall through in revisions? And then what was the first part?
Sorry, I like scrolled away.
I know, it vanishes.
Okay, how much world building do you plan ahead when you're working on a series?
Okay, so again, this is where I like kind of shot myself in the foot with the Witchlands. I like threw all this stuff in Truthwitch, which was awesome, and I dropped all these hints about stuff to come. And then I got to Windwitch, and I was like, ooh, I don't know about this. I thought it would be easy, and I thought I could make all these things align, but now that I'm there, this is not working. And it was like the ultimate. I felt like Windwitch was, you know how when you have a necklace girls, when you have a necklace and it gets completely screwed up and tied into a billion little knots in your jewelry box and you can't get the chains undone, it's like impossible to unknot that necklace. That's how I felt about Wind Witch. I had set all these things up and then I thought I would be able to handle and deal with in book 2. When I got there, characters they didn't want to do what I had thought they would do. It didn't feel right anymore. And so revealing the things that I thought I would be able to reveal no longer felt right. And it was like the ultimate puzzle of how to do what I needed to do, what I'd set up, in a way that felt genuine to the characters. And so that was hard. Like, on the one hand, yes, I planned ahead, but it almost made it worse for me in the long run. Then on the other hand, now that I've gotten them where they need to be, I also need to make sure everything's, the groundwork is laid for later books. So this is going to be a 5-book series, guys. Surprise! And so I need to make sure that I have laid everything that needs to come in the next book and the 4th book and then the ultimate 5th book, so that it feels natural and nothing feels, random and out of place, and everything that I promised you in Truth Witch is resolved in book 5. But yeah, then like I said, you end up removing things and revisions that you thought would be there, because either it no longer is relevant to the plot because maybe you made a change, or because readers don't need to know everything and I want to give you everything, and so I just have to pick and choose.
Okay, so since you're talking about the Witchlands, I have some more specific questions. Hopefully they're not too spoilery. Okay, so in Truth Witch, you said you wanted to write a book with no villain. So how has that affected your world building?
Oh my gosh. Guys. My husband makes fun of me because I always say I'll never do this again, and then I always do this again. But I always set a challenge for myself in a book, and so that I push myself as a writer, and because it's I shouldn't be afraid to tackle something that might be hard. But oh my gosh, why do I do this to myself? It would be so much easier if I could just write a story, My first series, for better or worse, there's a very clear bad guy. And once the bad guy is defeated, you have a very clear end. And when you don't have a villain, you don't have a very clear end, because there's no oh, Voldemort, or he who shall not be named is dead. Ding dong, the witch is dead. You can't say that. There is none of that. And so yes, not having a villain really affected everything. On the one hand, because there are characters that other characters think are villains, and that is very much a product of the character's upbringing and the world that they grew up in. So for example, a character who grew up in New Brevna, where Mary grew up, is going to think that every single person who's from one of the 3 empires is bad. They're pretty much just going to think that. And so, for example, Merrick in book 1 thinks Safi is just this arrogant, awful person from the Empire of Kartora. That is his prejudice. That's what he believes. She's a villain. But of course, as we learned, that's not true. And so I wanted to show that depending on which side of the border you're on, the villains change. And so ultimately that means there is no true villain. And yes, think smaller, guys. That's my advice for you. If you're going to do a no villain trick, don't do it in a massive world. Think smaller. It's so much easier.
Well, I think that's really cool that you don't have a clear villain, because every time you're in a different character's point of view, it sort of changes based on their perception of the world. So when you do have those multiple kingdoms, it's often easy to forget that those other kingdoms, those other countries have complex relationships with one another, not just with the kingdoms where your main characters are from. So you have a lot of political conflict in the Witchlands, and I feel it's all done really, really well.
Thank you.
How do you make it like concrete and understandable when you're working out all those political details?
I mean, thank you. I'm glad you think it's understandable. I worry that it's like too much because I do know like I like political stuff, but some people, that's eyes glass over immediately. So I try to keep it, bite-sizable, manageable.
Right.
How do I do it? I mean, I got my world guide to remind me of what all those relationships are because that's important. You don't want to forget that and get it wrong. And yeah, and then again, it comes down to how you feed the reader information in a scene. So I remember that you asked me about a scene that I had in book 2. There is a scene with a council. A character is trying to basically get her crown, and she can't have it. And there are reasons. And there are reasons why she wants it. And so you had commented that you thought it was it was a well-introduced scene. And that was, thank you, because I worked very hard on that, on introducing the members of the council in a way that's not necessarily overwhelming to the reader. And this comes down to, on a very small level, another tip from Suze, on how you name or do not name characters.
Yes.
So,
that was one of my favorite parts of that scene, actually. Yeah.
Thank you. You don't need to name every single character. You just need to name enough that it feels real. I'm going to do a really bad example of this for you guys, a little visual. But I remember learning in my very brief experience with art that if you want to draw like a wall, like a brick wall, rather than draw every brick, you can just draw a few and give the illusion of a brick wall. So, the bricks are there, you see them. So that's all you need to do, the same thing, in order to make a scene feel real, in terms of details, in terms of characters and who you name. You just give a few of the key names of the council, and it's enough. I think I only named like 2 or 3 of a council of like 13 people. And that's enough to make it feel real. You still have the conflict there, but they're the only ones who actually get a name. It's the same whenever you're going to offer some kind of a detail. You don't need to offer every single detail in a scene. You pick the ones that are important, and also you pick the ones that the character would notice. Because another thing that you had commented on was how you liked that there were things Merrick noticed which were different from what somebody else noticed in maybe the same scene. And so again, remember what I said about character and world linked. So what one guy notices is not going to be what another guy notices, and that what that character notices says a lot about who the character is. So getting back to like the political thing and the landscape of the Witchlands, again, it really all falls back into their own prejudices, what they notice about other people, what they believe about other people, what they've been raised to think. And these aren't things that you have to info dump right off the bat. These are things that will slowly get included into the story, scene by scene, bit by bit. We learn that Merrick thinks Safi's a brat, and that all Kartorans are brats. And, we learned that everyone's afraid of void witches, and that they automatically think Adwin, who is aligned with the void, must therefore be evil and a demon. I hope, spoiler alert, that you guys who've read the book know that's not true. So yeah, it really, I think it's all about how much you introduce, and making sure that you just don't overwhelm the reader, like introducing it a little bit at a time. I don't know that I succeeded that well in the first 100 pages of Truth Witch with that kind of stuff, but I tried. I think I do a better job of it in Wind Witch.
Okay, so you're talking about multiple points of view. It's like weirdly an echo.
Uh-oh. It might be mine. Let me get headphones. We'll be right back, guys.
Oh, hello, viewers. No, Kat, I'm not going to sing you a song or tell you a story.
Sorry, guys. I got headphones and some water. All right, let's get these plugged in. Is it still echoing for you?
No, I don't think so.
See if this makes it better.
Okay, Katie also says there's no more echo, so I think we're probably okay.
All right, this is a little short, but we'll do it. All right, sorry guys. Back to where we were.
Okay, so we're talking about, or you were talking about multiple points of view and how like certain characters see different scenes or different events in different ways just because of their own like prejudices. Keep track of what the truth is versus what characters actually believe to be the truth.
That is an excellent question, my friend.
Shout out to Katie for that question.
Thanks, Katie. That's a very good question. I guess to me, I know what the truth is because I established sort of those rules to begin with. And because I knew from the beginning that there would be no villains. So when I went into this, I knew that like there was always another side to every story. And so then it's a matter of when I'm in that character's point of view, remembering what they believe about people. And so that's actually where I find it a little bit harder to balance. Like I can remember the truth about who's, you know, who's actually at war with whom and why they dislike each other. What I can't always remember is like how they feel, what they actually think. And so, you know, that's like where you have hopefully beta readers and things who maybe, especially if they've recently read Truthwitch, they could say like, I don't think that's what he would believe. Don't you remember, Susan? And I'd be like, no, I don't. And so then you fix it. Because it definitely, like that kind of stuff can be very hard. It's your one brain trying to remember so many little things. You know, I feel like it's like a spider web, and at any moment it's just going to all kind of cave and tear apart. And so it is hard to keep it all afloat. But yeah, definitely harder to remember who believes what. So I recommend beta readers for that reason. I also recommend keeping meticulous notes like I don't do.
Oh, okay. So this is something I've seen people mention in the chat too. They want to talk about research. So let's maybe talk about that.
Yeah.
So while The Witchlands is a fantasy, you did draw some inspiration from history.
Yes.
What kind of stuff did you look at? Like journals, personal narrative books, and like why did you choose them?
Okay, so my first series was like obviously super research intensive, and so that was a lot of primary documents. And my husband is making a lot of noise. Can you hear that? Okay, good. I don't know what he's doing. Sam, stop! Real life is intruding. So research, yes. So I looked at a lot of primary documents. I tried to read a lot of like diaries and journals from that time period, and get a feel for like how people viewed the world. On the one hand, I did not make it accurate because there was some major racism going on in the 1870s. And I did not want to include that in my story. There's some subtle hits to it, but that was not part of that world or that story. So that I was not accurate in. And I was also not accurate in the fact that there was like walking corpses. So, you know, but everything else I tried to be pretty accurate about, like how maybe characters would interact in terms of like what the etiquette was and how, you had chaperones and what you would wear and what you would wear to this, to that. You would have your walking dress, and then you would have your dress for when you're just at home lounging and things like that. And again, research is black hole, but it's fun too. When it came to the Witchlands, because I do like research, and because this world was originally based on Croatia, in terms of like the vibe and the atmosphere of the world. So I wanted to like look at kind of the history of that, but very loosely. I mean, as you can tell, it's very, very different, but I did wanted to draw on the fact that for a while there were the three main empires, the Austrian, the Ottoman, and the Venetian, and I took pieces of that and made the Witchlands. And I got the idea for like the 20-year truce from the 12-year truce, which was, I think, between the Netherlands and Spain. Cool stuff like that. History is very cool. But then when it came to like actual research for the world itself, like one of the big things that I knew nothing about, but I wanted to try and get right, were boats, horses. I don't know anything about horses, and I don't know anything about, I know modern boats because I've worked on modern boats, but I don't know, like, you know, the old sailing ships. So I took like online workshops, one on the age of sail, and learned all about that stuff. And then I did one as well, an online workshop on like horses and things like that. And then I had some people I asked for help as well. So things like that. I don't think there's any excuse to get them wrong. Not something like that you can very easily learn about. I'm sure I still got some things wrong. But hopefully, certainly the average reader won't notice. It would have to be someone who is, you know, really familiar with sailing ships or horses. And then when it comes to like something that's a sort of topic that's on a lot of people's minds and should be, is the idea of having sensitivity readers and or someone to help you make sure that you get any kind of diverse characters you want to include. To make sure you do it respectfully and as accurately as you can. That is something that I really think people should do. And I think it's important to do it. I think it's important to find people who you may have to pay them, and in fact, you probably will have to pay them, and that is absolutely right, and you should, because they are doing you a service. But if you're lucky enough to maybe have a friend who will help you out, use that resource. We want to include diversity, but we need to also be respectful and do it right, at least to the best of our abilities. And so there's no excuse, again, for getting something really obviously wrong. And there's also no excuse for not trying to include it. So I have a character in Wind Witch who is non-binary, and so I have somebody reading for me right now to see how I did that and to make sure that I did that well. Also, another challenge that I decided to set for myself is to have a character who's going to transition in later books. I don't know how I'm going to do that. That is a scary thing that I am really scared of doing wrong, but I'm going to do my best and work with people who can help me do it best, because if a person can transition in their own life and learn, and the people around them can struggle and learn new pronouns, then damn it, I can do it in my books. So anyway, that's another part of research that you can't forget. Real things.
Yeah, that's really awesome, and people in the chat are talking about it and have
Are they? I hope
good things to say, like writing in the margins has a great sensitivity reader.
Oh, good.
Like Kat said, it's important to get more than one sensitivity read, because one experience is not.
I absolutely agree.
Everyone.
Yes, absolutely. It's I struggle with Wind Witch because I didn't have time until the very end, and I've only had time to get one, and I really, at least I know that I got his story right. But, you know, for future books, yes, absolutely, more than one sensitivity reader is key, because, again, not every experience is the same.
So that kind of brings me to, like, the last question that I wrote, which is, when you have like when you're creating your own fantasy world, things don't necessarily have to be the same as they are in this world. Like it can be more diverse. It doesn't have to be heteronormative. So like when you were writing the Witchlands, were there some assumptions like that you questioned? And then if you did, like how do you go about making sure that new reality is reflected consistently and realistically throughout the series?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it's awesome because in fantasy and sci-fi, you can really do that, like get rid of some things that, you know, we consider normal. And so I guess, you know, some of the obvious ones these days would be things like gender, this sort of binary assumption of gender. Ancillary justice would be an awesome example of a non-binary character in a non-binary world. It's awesome. And she handled it really interesting. And then I also think you can have this sort of, well, not heteronormative world. And so I hate to say that that is the way that our world is still, but it is, and you can change that in fantasy. So, and I don't really think there's any excuse not to these days. You know, it depends on what you're trying to achieve with your plot, but if your plot is not about, you know, some sort of the difficulties faced by someone who is, you know, in some kind of minority or persecuted group, there's no excuse then not to make, you know, a more broad definition of what normal is. So yeah, that's just my personal belief. Feel free to disagree with me, viewers, but I definitely know that in the Witchlands, there's no like one type of thing. I can't give that spoiler alert. I really wanted to say something, but that's a huge spoiler for later books. Well, let's just say it's definitely, yeah, it's definitely not something that we could do here, but in the Witchlands you can. Yes. Love for everyone.
Okay, so those are all the questions that I had.
Excellent. We had a few questions from, sorry, Katie, to tease, and other Katie, to tease, I'm sorry. I can give it away at the end of, after everyone's read Wind Witch, then I can hint at this more, but I can't now. So we had a few questions though from Twitter. Let me look at those.
Oh yes, I will look at them. How do you create such vivid descriptions of your world in Truth Witch?
How do I do it? Again, I think it's all about layering in. I print what I write so that I can read it, because I firmly believe that a printed page, you read it very differently than a page on your computer screen, and you interact with it very differently than a computer and a keyboard. So I highly recommend, especially for the layering in of details, that you print your manuscript if you can. And so, yes, I just sort of, when I'm in the scene, if it doesn't feel like there's enough, I'll add more. Other times you're way too close to your own book, and that's why you have critique partners and beta readers, and they might say, like, I am struggling to imagine this space. Can you please clarify it, or make it clearer, or make it better, or just add a few more details? And so that's incredibly helpful. But yeah, I think one of the best ways you can learn to get better at that, perhaps, is to go into a room and see what you notice. Like, intentionally go into a room and see what it is that you notice. I can tell you right now that what I notice and what my husband noticed are two completely different things. He notices cars. I do not notice cars for the life of me, but he will notice like every car that just passed on the street. So things like that look at what you notice, maybe ask some friends to go with you, see what they notice, and those are the kinds of details you want to include.
Yeah, I think that's really great because different people do notice very different things. So this is a question on Something Strange and Deadly. When did you know you were on the right track with your world building?
Oh, I don't know if I ever knew. I mean, I just knew I liked the story and the Victorian Ghostbuster element, and it was fun. So I followed that out to the end. I mean, there's no, like, I'm a big supporter of the right story and following what feels right, and not just writing a scene that's because it's on my outline. There's nothing wrong with that. Other authors do that fine. I literally cannot. I just cannot write words that don't feel right. It'll take me 6 hours to write 1,000 words. Whereas if the scene is working and it feels right, I can write 1,000 words in an hour. And so, I guess if you're not enjoying it and it just doesn't feel right, it's a slog to write, then it's not right. You're doing the wrong world building and the wrong story. And so step back, think about how else you could do it. Think about what excites you. Think about what's your cookie in the scene, what makes you just excited to work and write. And that's what you should be doing instead. And if you can't just come up with ideas of your own, then what I do is I like to think about, like, what did I love most in that movie? Or what did I love most in that video game? And why did I love it? And how can I do something like that in my own stories?
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Going back over to the chat, how much magic structure is too much structure?
Goodness, that's a good question. I guess it really depends on what you're trying to achieve with your story. And I think it also depends on who your target audience is. I think there's nothing wrong with having an incredibly structured, detailed magic. If it's so structured and detailed and complicated that it needs to be very heavily explained on the page, that could be problematic. In that only because most readers don't have the patience for that. It could work well in adult fantasy where readers do have a bit more patience for that kind of stuff, but it's a lot harder to do in, say, YA. So look at who your target audience is, look at what you're trying to achieve with the story, and then look at how much actually needs to be on the page, because you can make it as detailed and structured as you want. I can tell you, like, I got pages and pages of notes for my magics, but only a little bit actually gets onto the page for the audience.
Okay, how do you combine world building and creating distinct character voices?
Again, I think this ties into the, it depends very much on who the point of view character is in the scene. So they are going to notice certain things, and someone else is going to notice something else entirely. And so what they notice is going to say so much about who that character is and what their voice is. So for example, like, Safi is always going to notice if there's a deck of tarot cards around, and she's going to itch to play with them. And so that's something that she would notice, but not somebody else. And so, yeah, just little things like that. I mean, think about who your character is, think about what they would notice in a scene, and that will really link the two.
Okay, how do you decide how much to take from the real world? Sometimes I find myself getting attached to details and forgetting that I can veer from history.
That is a good question, because when you take from the real world, I mean, and I'm guilty of this because I obviously have written a alternate history, and then Truthwitch being very loosely based on some historical stuff. You run the risk of cultural appropriation. That's something that you always have to worry about. It doesn't matter if it's like modern day appropriation or historical appropriation. It can be quickly problematic and offensive. And so I think the key is to remember, again, always go back to what you're trying to achieve with the story. What were the questions that you posed at the beginning of the story, and what do you want to have answered by the end, and what do you need to do that? And I think the best way to avoid anything feeling taken without feeling like you've taken it for the sake of taking it, like, having somebody you know, some sort of cultural garb just because it looks cool. I think as long as there's a reason for every single thing that you're using in the story and that you can explain that, maybe it doesn't make it onto the page, but you as the writer know why that's there, what the historical significance of it is in your world, then you can do this safely. And, you know, you might still end up offending someone. Unfortunately, that's always going to happen. But I think if you're really thoughtful about it and you're showing your 10% of the iceberg, but you know the 90% underneath, then that's okay. But the question was what about how you allow yourself to veer away from the real world? Was that it?
Yeah.
And like I don't have that problem. So I think just, again, like think about what you're trying to do with your story. If you can stick really closely to real history, awesome, do that. Make it more of an alternate history. But if the story demands that you veer off pretty sharply, then make sure when you do, you're not just cherry picking stuff from the real world. I don't know if that answers your question, friend. I'm sorry. I tried.
Oh my gosh, no, it just all disappeared.
Oh no. Katie Steele says it's a fine line between copying other worlds and going too far. This is very, very true, Katie. I mean, I feel like there's lots of, well, Game of Thrones, for example, does an excellent job of sort of mimicking real world cultures and real world events in a real war, without ever feeling like too much like a rip of the real world or like it's cherry picking details.
So I know you've talked about this a little bit on your newsletter about like creating maps and stuff. So when do you do it? If you're like, do you use a map like when you're doing your world building, the preliminary stages?
Yes. I made a map of the Witchlands before I started writing. I definitely do that. I changed a few of the names on there and like tweaked a few of the borders, but the general, everything was there exactly like it is now. And I did the same thing in book 2, there's the capital of New Brevna, and I made a map of the city so that I could follow it. I just find it personally easier because then you don't, make things happen too quickly, if they're really far apart, or you don't screw up. I don't know, like I have a problem with I'm slightly obsessive with it, like making sure that the weather matches up everywhere and that the moon is in the same place that it is over here, but the time difference is aligned and blah, blah, blah. And so it just helps me if I have my map so I can make sure everything is right. Also, I just think maps are really fun. I think I like drawing maps, and I also feel like I get a lot of ideas from maps. Yeah, like when you see how something is aligned or set up or who's next to each other, you get ideas for conflict or, yeah, stuff like that. It's fun. Maps. Hey.
Lots of people talking about cookies.
Yay. I see someone asks, wait, just on the maps thing, do I do them by hand or by a computer program? I do them by hand. And I'm not like a great artist or anything, but I definitely draw by hand. I use erasable pens, these friction pens that are amazing. Get them. They're kind of expensive, but they're so worth it. But I draw my maps that way. I'll have to share a picture of a map sometime. Yeah.
Well, this is a very personal question that, I mean, not personal, but something that I've been struggling with recently is figuring out borders between my different kingdoms and sort of what type of borders exist, whether it's something that's very concrete and there's a river and when you cross the river it's a different kingdom, or whether there's lands that are fought over or whatever. So how did you figure out your like borders?
Yes, this is all right. I mean, definitely, I think looking at like how historical real world borders happen is a great way to start. And so I definitely try to have like, you know, there's like a river between these two places. But then I also have this issue where they're like, it's three empires who have essentially taken over other nations.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that sense, I kind of more just was able to say like, well, they fought here and we stopped here, and it's not necessarily based on a river or anything. So yes, I think it just depends on what you're trying to do. I wouldn't overthink it. I do think it's good to look at like how we really do come up with that and maybe have a reason, but I also don't think you need to overthink it. If that's where the border is, that's where the border is, unless it's super important to the story. It's okay to just to draw it and leave it there and maybe put a river or a mountain. I don't know.
Yeah, it's kind of important to my plot, but that's a good.
Well, then if it is, then you can think about all of those things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Erin asks, a lot of fantasy worlds tend to feel the same. How do you make your world unique without making it feel too unique, like similar to other things out there, I guess?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I was discussing this earlier with Lee Bardugo and Alexandra Bracken, actually, because we were discussing how, to some extent, readers like the familiar.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why you see a lot of familiar fantasy in YA, which isn't a bad thing. It's an excellent thing. Whereas a lot of those books wouldn't sell in adult fantasy because it's all been done before, and that genre has been around for so long that like you have to be building some incredibly unique worlds to stand out in the adult fantasy world. And so it's hard, right? Like it's great because in YA we can kind of tread ground that's been tread, but we can't do that in the adult world. But then on the other hand, it can be frustrating because if you deviate too far from what readers consider familiar fantasy, then they might not like your book. It might be too much world building for them and they put it down. Fair enough. So my suggestion, of course, is to read a lot so that you know what's been done. Read the fantasy greats and read also what's coming out currently. Especially if your audience is YA, read YA fantasy. If your audience is adult, read that. And then this is hard because it's like on the one hand, make the world that you want to make, but on the other hand, like, can you guys hear that? My cat is sneezing over and over and over. It's like a rapid fire machine gun sneeze out there. It's very distracting. Sorry. I mean, I think make the world that you want to make, because yeah, you can always, you know, if you love something, that magic shines through. I loved the world of the Witchlands. On the one hand, it's sort of familiar because it is vaguely European. On the other hand, it's like far more Eastern European than perhaps a lot of, I don't want to say like it's unique because that's I don't think that's necessarily true, but it's not necessarily been done as much, that vibe that I was going for. Right. But at the same time, I hope it's familiar enough that people can read it and be like, oh yeah, I get that. Okay, swords, cool. Dragons, cool. Although I don't really have dragons, but kind of. That familiarity lends itself to like I know what I'm getting. Okay, and we like that. Viewers, readers, we do like tropes. We all joke about it and say like break tropes, but at the end of the day, we all do really like them. But I do think that there's like a way you can bring a different angle to it or a unique take on it. And again, no one's going to write the book that you write. So at the very end of the day, it's unique because it's your voice. So that's helpful.
Yeah. So I'm looking through here. These aren't really questions. If anyone asked a question that we missed and you're still around, please repeat them so we can catch them.
Yes, I'm sorry, guys. It was a lot of chatting and it was hard to do it at the same time. Thank you, Kit Meow, for my Eastern Europe is the bomb.com. I feel like I must have hit a nerve because I've, like, all the foreign rights I've sold have been Eastern European. And so I feel like, yeah, I did it. I nailed it.
That's awesome.
Like, it's like literally all that whole board of like Poland down to Turkey. So I was like, yeah, I must have gotten something right.
Yes, I agree with all this. Agree with Mara. I like there being a recognizable aesthetic. I definitely feel like the Witchlands has like an aesthetic.
I feel like the book one cover really nailed the aesthetic. I imagine a very like turquoise blue. That is how I see the Witchlands. It's like that turquoise blue color of the ocean in the Adriatic Sea. That is my aesthetic.
Okay, so if you have to scrap or redo a lot of world building, how do you trust yourself with new ideas instead of doubting everything?
Oh, that's a tricky question. Good question. One, I would say if you find a trusty friend / reader. I really think it's important to have someone you can brainstorm with. And I know it's not easy to find those people, you know. It takes a while, but it's worth having it once you have them, because they really can help you say, like, Axe, you're overthinking your borders, or maybe you're not, you know. And so those are the kinds of things it's helpful to have someone who's got an outside, more objective perspective than you.
Right.
But then at the same time, I guess, I mean, first of all, doubt and uncertainty are going to live with you forever in this business. I hate to break it to you, friend. You probably already know. But it's just, that's the way it is. It doesn't matter how successful you are, how many books you've sold, or, you know, who you are. You know, you still have a crap ton of doubt with every single thing you write. And you second guess everything or quadruple guess. So it's normal to doubt. Don't worry about that. I think the question is going to be, are you making things more complicated, or are you making them simpler? I think I'm the queen of overcomplicating my worlds and my plots. Are you nodding because you do that too?
Yes.
Yes. And so my editor is constantly saying to me, does this add to the story, Susan, or not? If it's not adding to the story, if it's just making it more complicated without actually adding to the story, then I don't need it. And I'm like, I'm prone to do this. Like I said, I have like different elite fighting forces. I don't need this many elite fighting forces. It's too many. And it might feel real because that's how the real world would work, but the reader doesn't need that, and it's too much. So I guess, yes, think about if you are actually improving the story based on your gut, how does it feel, or are ultimately you just overcomplicating it? Because the simpler you can make it, it can still be rich and complex, but there's a difference between that and overcomplicated or convoluted. I know that probably doesn't help. Again, beta readers, critique partners are going to be your best bet.
What do you do if you're really proud of a certain aspect of your world building, and then you read someone else's book and they have something very similar?
So this is if you've read the book and you see something really similar. I mean, look, there is like no new idea. I'm just going to throw that out there. So what makes it different is that you're telling it and it's your voice. So remember that. I know I got like really paranoid because I have this sort of Greek fire in Windwitch, and that's like been done a million times. I'm not unique in having that, but it is important to the story, and I needed it to be there. So even though I was like, well, thanks, George R. R. Martin, for making everyone know Greek fire. I did it anyway, and that's that. So I wouldn't worry too much, you know, if you see something that's like incredibly specific and you've read the book and it's scary similar to the point where you think someone could accuse you of copying, even though you didn't, you might want to reconsider. But like, for example, when I wrote Something Strange and Deadly and I just sold it, and right after that, like literally the same week, this book called The Clockwork Angel by Cassandra Clare came out. And when I read the summary, it sounded identical to mine. Girl in 1876, brother goes missing. She joins up with the shadow hunters to find him. And the twist at the end is even the same as mine. And I read that book because I was like, oh my God, I'm going to get, you know, I'm screwed. People are going to think I copied her when I obviously couldn't have, because this book wasn't out. I couldn't have read it. And then I read it, and of course it was very similar, but also very, very not.
Right.
And so I can say, like, well, if you like Clockwork Angel, you'd probably like Something Strange and Deadly. So just remember that only you can tell it your way. So don't worry. Everything's been done before. Other questions?
Okay, how do you not create so many characters to keep the plot moving, but create enough to keep it interesting?
Interesting question. I assume you mean not point of view characters, but just characters. I think characters can very quickly become overwhelming. I think anytime you have more than like 3 characters in a scene, it can quickly become overwhelming because you want to remind the reader that all those other characters are there, but having them all talk and exchange in a scene, it gets complicated for the reader, it gets complicated for the author. So I personally always try to keep scene casts very small. And yes, so that's sort of my advice, is actually that you don't need that many to keep it interesting. I think you don't want your character to be alone. When I was really struggling to write Windwitch, I foolishly had Merrick be alone for pretty much the first version of what became the final draft. And even I got halfway through and I was like, this isn't working. And then I was like, duh, because I broke one of the most obvious rules of writing, and that is that your character should never be alone. They always need to be with somebody. And so I made a new character, and that person is with Merrick throughout the book. So, and it changed everything. It totally changed the dynamic and everything. And because other characters are a source of conflict, they're a source of humor, they're a source just of making the scene feel more alive, which you've noticed, because it's more interesting with more people. But I do think anytime you get more than like 4 or 5 people in a scene, you're just going to get overwhelming. I try to stick to even fewer if possible. When I had this scene with the council, of course, I had like 14 people in a room. And so then, in that case, even though there were that many people in the room, I only ever named and gave dialogue to 3 of them. So, something to consider. Good question.
Yeah, these are really good questions.
Yeah.
Any tips on figuring out if a secondary character doesn't quite fit?
That is such a good question. Because I did this, so I can really resonate with this. When I was writing a draft after draft after draft after attempted draft of Windwitch, I had this secondary character that I really wanted her in there. I just clung to this character heart and soul, even though I should have seen that it wasn't working, because I kept having to redo her and I just couldn't seem to land her voice, and I kept trying all these different approaches to this character. And then finally I realized she didn't need to be there at all, and that it should be a completely different character. And so again, I go very much by like what my heart is feeling and my gut. And so sometimes you just have to say, like, this doesn't feel right. It's not working. I can't get this character's voice right. And instead of trying to cling to keeping them like I was doing and writing myself in circles, Just say, you know what? No. What happens if I get rid of this character entirely? And play that out. Play it out in your head. See what happens. Do you need to replace that character at all? Should you create another character to fill that person's role, or can you get away with it without having them? I ended up just not having them, and it was okay. So, yeah, that's a really good question. I think too, if you don't trust your own gut, then again, talk to like a critique partner or outside reader if you can. And if you don't have a critique partner or a reader, I have lots of resources on my site, of course, on the website, but I recommend like there's writers' blogs and places like that, forums, Absolute Right, that are great places to meet people like you in maybe a less scary, location than just like Twitter.
Yeah, and like I met my first critique partners through your website, Suze, and then I also met some on Maggie Stiefvater's.
Yes, Maggie's got a good one.
And then just once you have like your group of people, you just meet other people through them. And at least that's how I've met all my critique partners.
Yeah, me too. I think that's very true. I'm still friends with like almost all of my original, like very first critique partners too. So that's cool.
Aww. Yeah, all my critique partners are talking about random things in the chat right now.
Thanks, guys. You're eating it up.
Wait, what Tinkerbell question? Well,
what if none of the characters feel right? Kit me out. Do you mean like none of your characters feel right? Not even the point of view characters, your main characters? In that case, I would say that this is not the story you should be working on right now. Definitely happens sometimes that you write a character or a story and it just doesn't work. The voice isn't coming and it doesn't feel right. No one feels right. I've definitely had that book. And I think it's usually a sign that the idea isn't there yet. Let it simmer for another year or two and then get back to it. Look, you can have an idea that's awesome, but if the idea is just this one little piece, it's not big enough to write an entire book on. Ideas have to have other ideas that like come together to make it bigger and bigger and bigger. And then it is large enough for you to make into a full book. I had the first spark of the idea for Truth Witch in like 2010, 2009. So it was like 4 years before I actually wrote the book. Any other questions? I know there were a few more from Twitter. So,
like on Twitter right now?
No, from earlier. Someone had asked.
Oh no, I think I closed out of the thing.
When somebody asked about a high fantasy that they're writing that is a cross between two fairy tales, and they want to know how to decide what to use in the original settings, should both cultures and traditions from those fairy tales be equally balanced? I mean, that's a really hard question because I don't know the project. Again, I go back to the like cultural appropriation thing. Just be very careful that what you're using is, critical to the story, and also it isn't just there because it looks cool or seems cool. That there's a reason that you're using or basing something on real tradition. So, yeah, just remember that. Be careful, and again, if you're not sure you're handling it well, then ask someone maybe because I think the two fairy tales or stories she's using, one's Mulan and one's Aladdin, so definitely you want to talk to people who are maybe from those original cultures, or at least more so than you are, and can give you some insight into whether or not perhaps you are going too far. I don't know. That's tricky for me. That's something that I think you should definitely research very, very, very thoroughly. Very, very thoroughly.
Tips on building the right mythical creatures for your world. You have cool mythical creatures. I think I told you this.
Do you think so? I don't know. I got all like it's like weirdly symbolic and weirdly like foreshadowing what's to come, and I just went maybe a little too deep into it with my creatures. But I don't know. I just wanted to have like a cross between like what you would expect in that world, in that place, like the sea, and then a fox, which obviously is not a sea creature. So I wanted it to be like a mashup of things. You have a flame hawk, so it's a hawk made of fire. It's obviously all very elemental. We have some more creatures coming in Wind Witch. But there is like I remember talking to someone maybe like a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. And this person was like, why don't you could just add this creature if you want, or just add that. And this was where my rules came in handy. I had established that I only had 6 kinds of mythical creatures in this world. And that was it. And there are no more. And there will be no more. So I was like, nope, that won't work. And they were like, well, you can just change it. Just do it. And I was like, nope, that might work for some people, but it does not work for me. I have my rules and I'm going to stick to them. And hopefully that makes it feel more grounded and logical.
How do you decide what point of view feels right for the plot?
That is a very good and very difficult question. People write entire books on that. So I suggest there's a good one called Deep POV by Alicia Rasley. Recommend it. I guess the point of view character, assuming you're not writing like a sequel or something, but to me the point of view character should be the one who, actually that's not true. The main character should be the one who has the most at stake, I think, or who can affect the plot the most and drive the plot the most. So, for example, like you could have someone who has the most at stake, and that would be a character, who's, I don't know, about to lose their family's about to lose their house if this kid doesn't, do something. Or you could have the character who can affect the plot the most, and that would be someone who's like Superman. He's not necessarily got a whole lot at stake, but he can do the most to help people, so he's the one who's the main character. Of course, the main character does not necessarily need to be the point of view character if you want to get complicated. For example, Sherlock Holmes. Mm-hmm. Lots of mysteries do this, because Agatha Christie did the same thing. So yes, you don't always have to have the main character be the point of view character. I think it really just depends on what you want to achieve. So yeah, I'm not sure that helps. I definitely think you should read like resources on that, because that is an entire workshop, an hour discussion in and of itself. Point of view is tricky, friend.
Well, I was actually going to say, if this one went well, if you actually wanted to do one on point of view, because there's so much to talk about, and I really like a lot of the ways in which you do your multiple points of view. And
all right, so maybe when I get back from France in 2 weeks, we'll do another one of these. If you guys would want that and it would be helpful to anyone out there, then I'm all for that.
Okay,
yes.
I really like this question. So, writing short stories, how do you pack world building into a much smaller size story?
This is an excellent question, and I'm not going to lie, something I struggle with. I am awful at writing short fiction. When I wrote the novella A Dawn Most Wicked, I basically wrote a novel and then just tightened it until it was 130 pages. It is like, my friends make fun of me for that, because it's as complicated and as layered as a novel. I just made it so tight in words. There's no fluff. So I got it down to 130 pages. So it's like really long for a novella. And I can't, I wrote this short story for this Because You Love to Hate Me anthology that's coming out about villains. And obviously I love villains, or villains. So I agreed to write it because I was like, sure, I can write 25 pages, even though I should know that I'm not good at that. And it took me a month to write that story. Which, let me tell you, my agent and editor were like, why did you agree to this, Susan? You have a book due. But I ended up loving that story, and I cannot wait for you guys to read it. It's like one of my favorite things I've ever written, but it was so hard for me to do because I just could not introduce everything that needed to be introduced, set up a plot, have a character grow and learn in 20, 25 pages. It was very, very hard for me, but I pushed myself and I did it. I'm really proud of what happened. So good for me, I guess. Try what's hard and scary. But yeah, I again, I would urge you to look at some books on short fiction. I think when it comes to doing that, you need to make sure, because this is where I struggled, you need to make sure that the plot is very simple. That's my problem, is that I don't do simple plots very well. And so you have to make sure that it's just like one main plot, that there's no really, or subplot going on, or they're very small. And you also need to make sure that whatever you do introduce and reveal about the world, it's only the key critical stuff that people need for this story. I suggest the best way, I think, to learn how to do something, though, is to see how other people do it. So read some fantasy short stories, or fantasy novellas, or whatever length it is that you're trying to write. Read those and see exactly how they do it and take notes. And then don't copy, but imitate, Try to do what they did in your own story, in your own world. That's what I do. I'm constantly taking notes.
Mm-hmm. When writing your story, how do you know how many books the series would be? Does it change as you go along, or did you already plan it out with an ending?
All right, so that's a good question. This book series I intended to be 4. And then this summer, because I realized that, in order to slowly introduce all of the key things that would later come into play without overwhelming the reader with the world and the backstory and the history, it was going slower than I thought it would be. I needed to really space it out more. And I went to my editor and I was like, how do you feel about a 5th book? And she was like, I knew you were going to ask that. We all knew, because there was no way you could wrap up all of this in 4 books. So clearly they knew better than I did. Yay. I bet they're all probably, I'm like, it'll be 5. I bet they're probably thinking it'll be 6. But we'll see. 5 is, I don't want to go longer than 5. 5 is such a nice number, and I have perfect titles for everything. So, but that said, when it came to my first series, Something Strange and Deadly, I wrote that actually as sort of a standalone, but with a few threads that were loose. So if needed, if it turned out that no publisher wanted a sequel, I could easily remove those little loose threads or wrap them up, and it would be 1 book. But fortunately, HarperCollins wanted 3, so trilogies were super hot back then. So I was able to very easily expand that into 3. I knew it was 3 from the beginning. I definitely, like I mentioned, had a little bit of the too much information in one scene in the 3rd book to wrap everything up. But for the most part, I was still able to, I did everything I wanted to do. I planned it well, and I got it in 3 books. Epic fantasy was new for me. Writing a non-3 book structure was new for me. So I planned 4, turned into 5. I'll stick with 5. 5 is a good structural shape, by the way, guys. 5-act is something you see a lot of, so we're going to stick with that. Other questions?
Someone asked about music. How do you create a playlist? I mean, I just steal from your playlist, but
I don't know that I'm a music writer. Music is key to me. I don't actually listen to music that much while writing. It depends on what I'm doing, what I'm writing. I can listen to music when I'm doing an action scene, but if it's more of a dialogue-driven scene, no. But I still need music when I'm brainstorming and planning and thinking. And I just, Spotify is my favorite thing, because they always have the browse similar artists, and then I just go through that. I'm constantly keeping tabs on what new video game soundtracks have come out, and I'll give them a listen. And that's actually how I found Dragon Age, which is my obsession. My obsession was because I listened to the soundtrack first, and I was like, man, that is beautiful. And I got obsessed with the soundtrack. And then someone emailed me and was like, have you actually played the game? I think you'd like it. And there went my life. Which was fun though, because I was done with Truthwitch at that point, and I got all these cool, like, I love RPGs and video games because they do world building. It's like a whole team behind the world building, so the level of detail that they're able to add is like something that my brain cannot possibly do because it's just one and they have like 100 working together. Right. But it's great because you can get ideas in a nice like RPG that's in the same genre as what you're writing, and you can be like, what did they include? What cool detail did they include? And how can I want to do something like that? That's a good idea. So I definitely, when I was writing Wind Witch, I was like, what cool things did they include in Dragon Age or in The Witcher? What little details can I also include in a similar way? Yeah. I don't even remember what the original question was. Sorry, guys. I started talking about video games. Oh, music. I started talking about video games, and there went everything. Music, yeah. I just find what I like, and then you guys can all find me on Spotify, and if you like it, keep it. Add it to your own playlists, and send, if you find something you like, tweet it at me, because you know I will click and listen.
Do you ever just come up with plot points on the fly, like, oh, new idea, insert here?
Yes, in first books. Yes, I do. Because you can do that in like a first book in a series, and there's no consequences. You can just be like, oh, I'm gonna have them do this, yeah, and see where it takes you. And oftentimes those are like really exciting. Sometimes you write yourself in a corner and you're like, nope, shouldn't have done that, and you just back it up and go back to where it branched and you should go this way. But like, it's a lot harder to do that in later books where, one, you don't want to introduce something that you maybe won't have time to wrap up in later books. And you don't want to introduce anything that feels too, random and disconnected from the overall story. That said, I will say that there's something in Wind Witch that like I did not see coming myself, and then when it came, I was like, oh snap, I like this. How can I make this work? And it all ended up working beautifully and being the perfect solution to my Wind Witch stuck problem. But at that time, it just seemed like this random idea. But you know what? Trust the randoms. I feel like all of us, our brains are magical things, guys, and there's all this stuff going on back here. And sometimes that cool stuff that's simmering and growing comes up here and it comes out and you're like, aha, magic. It's not magic. It's awesome. And write it. Remember those things, because those are going to be the coolest parts.
Question from Erin. Do you have more epic fantasies planned for the future?
I would like to. We'll see. By the time I finish the series, it will be like 2019. So I have no idea what will come. I have another epic fantasy series that's on my hard drive that is, the first book is mostly written. It's very different though. It's epic fantasy, but in a world with technology, so it's like super different. But we'll see. We'll see what I want to write when I get there, what you guys want to read. I don't want to write something that y'all won't want, because that is zero fun for me. The reason I write books is for you people, because that's the fun part. So we'll see. You guys let me know in 2019 what you want to read. We'll talk.
When writing an action scene, do you already have it planned out, or do you go with the flow of the scene and the words?
Erin asked about Screechers. Yes, hon, it's Screechers. How do you even know that? Are you on my Pinterest board? Are you on my Pinterest boards? Is that how? I love you, by the way. That's awesome. Okay, so what was the question? I'm sorry, I just happened to see that.
When writing an action scene, do you already have it planned out or do you just go with the flow?
Both. Okay, so I should show you guys sometime in my other office because I have two, because as my husband says, I have taken over the whole house. It's true. I have a marker board on the wall, and like in the top corner, I have a triangle written. The bottom part of the triangle says knowledge, and that is that I have to plan a very bare bones, what I call my screenplay of the scene before I write it. If you go on my website, I describe how I do all of this on the like how I plan a novel section. But I have my little scene screenplay, and so I think these are they're important in scenes where you have dialogue, and they're important in scenes where you have action. Because action can actually get boring pretty fast if things aren't changing and the stakes aren't going higher. And if you're not invested in the scene. And so I find that if I don't have a very clear direction for what needs to happen in the action scene, then I just kind of like meander writing cool action stuff, but that doesn't actually really matter. It just looks cool. And so I will write down like a very bare bones, like, it's an example that's not a spoiler. There's like a bar scene in Windwitch that Merrick is in, and it's like a big fight, and I made sure to like kind of map out the basics of the fight. He kicks here, he throws here, he ducks here, and it's just like a really vague outline. It takes me about 5 minutes to write, and then once I get into the scene, I'll play like my really loud 2 Steps from Hell, and I'll write that. Same with dialogue, because otherwise my characters will just do endless boring banter back and forth, which I like love my witty banter in my fan fiction, but I don't like reading it in books. It gets old really fast to me. I think you need just enough witty banter, and then the rest of it should be really part of plot-driven dialogue that is developing the plot, the story, the characters, not just fun conversation for the sake of fun conversation, which again, I love in my fan fiction, just not in a book.
Your witty banter is so amazing, and when it was so funny.
I'm glad you think so. I'm like really excited for you guys to read this. I don't know why, because this book, it almost broke me, as many of you who follow me know, but I really hope y'all like it. We'll see. We'll see very soon. ARCs will be coming out in like 2 weeks, so get ready, guys. Any other questions? I feel like there's probably 1 or 2, and then I will go to bed like the old woman that I am.
Lexi says, the action scene in the beginning of Truth Witch is amazing. I agree.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ellie says, Isolde versus Adwin is my fave. Me too.
I think you guys are going to like book 2.
I think so too.
Which I'm not spoiling anything. It's in the summary of the book, so.
Excitement over arcs.
Yay!
Yeah. All right. It doesn't look like there are any more questions.
All right, my loves. Thank you.
Well, thank you for answering all my questions.
Did I actually help you? I mean, this was really to help you, and then I thought people should be able to be like weird voyeurs and watch it. Hey, guys. So did it actually help you at all? If not, then feel free to like ask me again. We'll email about it or something.
No, this was super helpful.
Yeah, as mentioned, there were a few links I'm going to put in the bottom. I think I said the world building one and books that I liked. So I'll put that in the description for people. And if you guys, like, show of hands, who wants to like do maybe a POV character one of these? It's going to be a delay before I can see what you guys think, but
yay, looks like people found it really helpful.
Yay, good guys.
About hate fighting romances. Hands. Oh, yay.
Oh, okay, yay, thanks. Good, hands, yay. Hate fighting romances. All right, I feel like that should be part of the like character POV one, because you know, character POV is very much all about relationship development as well. So we can do that if you guys want, especially if you guys are doing NaNoWriMo, if it might be helpful to you. I will be gone until November 6th, 7th, so we could do it that week I come back.
Yeah.
All right. Akshaya, thank you.
Thank you.
Amazing. Yeah, and thank you for everyone who watched. All the way to the end while I rambled. So I hope everyone found this somewhat helpful. And if not, sorry. Maybe the next one will be better. And yeah, don't miss Clan Chat tomorrow night for those of you who are Witchlanders or want to be Witchlanders. It starts at 5. I should check on that. 5, I believe. And I also have a newsletter coming out tomorrow with the very first scene of Wind Witch in it. So make sure you're subscribed so you can read that. And yay.
Yay. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye, guys. I'm going to stop this broadcasting now. Wave goodbye, Axe.
Bye.